And Lisa, you can get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. And thanks very much to the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network for including me today. This is a very worthwhile discussion, and I'm really excited to be with Durhane to talk about this. So I founded the Canadian CML Network about 10 years ago when I was diagnosed with CML. It's chronic myelogenous leukemia, a rare blood cancer. And so it affects roughly, it's rare-ish, I guess, affecting around 5,000 people in Canada. 20 years ago, there wouldn't have been treatment, and I probably wouldn't be here today. However, thanks to the clinicians who worked hard to pursue research, they were able to discover what would put CML into remission for many people. Not all, but for many. So these days, the drugs cost roughly $4,000, $4,500 to $6,000 per month, and I know that that's not expensive. Some of you are probably shaking your heads and not expensive relative to many rare cancer treatments. But it's still expensive. And depending on where you live in Canada, how you pay can be very different, which kind of makes things a little bit complicated. Allison, could you change the slide, please? So one of the top challenges of living with CML is figuring out how to live with cancer. And, we're seeing this more and more now with a lot more people, thankfully, living with cancer, but we're not used to that. We're used to people who have cancer and die, and then those who have cancer get treatment, and then it's done with. So with CML, like many chronic cancers, there's a daily treatment, and for the foreseeable future, we can look toward a future with a daily medication in order to keep our disease in remission. But to live with it is to figure out how to live well with cancer, especially with something that you equate with death, can be very difficult. And that's when I started the CML Network. That was actually our primary focus, was to basically help people live well with something that could potentially kill them. Can you move the slide ahead there, Allison? Thank you. So this is specific to CML and other chronic cancers, but if we were to take a look at rare cancers as a whole, what makes them unique? So there are a whole bunch of things, and I know Durhane's going to get into this a little bit deeper, but there's a lot of things that that make rare cancers unique. And first and foremost is often a lack of education and information. With CML, we're getting there, but generally when I was diagnosed, there wasn't a whole lot of information out there. And you're Googling, you're not getting credible information. There's also remote and not so remote areas are underserved. So this I always kind of find funny is when I say to people, that, so remote patients, so patients that live in remote areas don't actually have adequate CML treatment or access to adequate information. And people, when I say remote, they think, the country, but I'm actually talking about, and this is the case with many rare cancers, just outside of the city core. You can easily find a doctor who would go in and give you the diagnosis of CML, and right in front of you, Google it, and basically give you the first treatment that comes up, despite, regardless of whether or not it fits necessarily with, your comorbidities, etc. And limited reimbursement. Generally with CML, you can get reimbursed, although the way you pay and how you pay is different across Canada, which makes things pretty difficult. In rare cancers as well, if you have treatment, that's always the first thing to think about. But if you have treatment, reimbursement is often a really large challenge. And when you're facing a life and death situation, you really don't want to be worried about how you're going to pay for your medication. And the whole lack of education in terms of rare cancers really comes into play in this arena. We actually have a patient now who has a rare leukemia who's now carrying a line of credit of $80,000 because she paid for a drug that actually has a compassionate program, but because it was a rare cancer and the clinician wasn't too familiar with it, and she's also not educated, there's also not a group for her to go to find information and advice, she went ahead and paid for this medication. And so we see things like that happen all the time. And again, lack of information and education connected to the lack of public awareness. Not a lot of support for people that live with rare cancers. And it really contributes to this whole cycle of feeling at a loss, and not to mention the whole emotional impact of that, but there really isn't a place to go for many rare cancers to have a safe landing place. And again, fewer no support organizations feeds into all of this as well. Can you move the slide ahead? So really the reality of advocacy in the world of rare cancers is basically we have to work on many levels and in different spheres. Durhane does an amazing job of this. But so for the CML network, so we started basically local own backyard issues, basically helping patients that were local to us, patient support, so education, peer connection, and navigation. But because we need to, not only is it the right thing to do, but in order to support our patients the right way and families and make sure that outcomes are really the best that they can be, we also have to get into health policy. So that means influencing government and policymakers and really getting in there and shaping policy. And then research as well. So a lot of collaboration with industry and clinicians, but also other groups. And so the flip side of that is all of this happens on a national and global level as well. So, us and other rare cancer groups are often part of huge global initiatives. I mean, Durhane's a great example. CORD also works very much so on an international framework, and we work nationally as well. I mean, this is all reality in terms of moving things forward in the world of rare cancers. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say before I turn it over to Durhane is that the small numbers. Because of small numbers, dollars don't tend to drive policy and research the way it might be, the way it might in more common cancers like breast and lung. And so, to say that we have our work cut out for us is an understatement, but there is a lot of great inroads happening in this area. And, before we went on the call, Durhane and I were talking about, how just it's amazing and reassuring. There's been a lot of interest in rare cancer to support in the last, particularly in the last year or so, and we will be hosting a rare cancer workshop coming up in May at the Rare Disease Conference. And so, if you're interested, come out and see, because I'm sure that even in just a couple of weeks, we're going to have some new things to talk about. So, Durhane, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you also for making the time. Lisa's actually on holidays in some wonderful place in Mexico. So when I asked her, she said, without hesitation, of course, I'll be happy to join you. So huge thanks to you. We're really, and also want to acknowledge, Lisa has always been a great partner with us in many activities and has always contributed to what we're doing in terms of rare diseases. And we've talked for years about the importance in trying to raise awareness around and maybe building some alliances around rare cancer. So this we see as maybe our tipping off point to be able to do this. Lisa also joined our board at CORD over this past year, so we're delighted to be able to actually have her, really have her working with us to help build this and to also advance rare cancers as part of rare diseases. So we talked about it, the time to act is now, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the backdrop to rare cancers and also kind of not only the definition, but what are some of the opportunities and challenges. So next slide, please. So the key points. First, here's what we'll cover. Rare cancers are really not so rare. And that's sort of saying the same thing as rare diseases. In some respects, they're not really so rare. What we're talking about also is people ask, well, what if we're talking about cancer subtypes? Is a subtype of a prostate cancer, of a breast cancer, of a lung cancer, is that also a rare cancer? And I think that we don't need to quarrel about whether or not it is on the numbers. We can talk a bit about how subtypes of more common cancers actually have some of the same characteristics and challenges and opportunities as rare cancers. Their effective therapies for rare cancers are based on the genetic defect. So most rare cancers are actually defined by a genetic mutation, genetic defect. We're going to talk a little bit about the orphan drug regulatory framework. What are some of the opportunities coming up, including precision therapies, life cycle approach, and a manage and treat programs. Next slide, please. Can you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so what is a rare cancer? And actually, globally, the terminology has now become rare and less common cancer. So you'll see that in the literature, RLC. In Canada, in 2017, there were about 206,600 new cases of all cancers, with an estimated death of 80,800 deaths from all cancers. Compare that to what we call rare and less common cancers. There were 62,100 estimated cases, and I have to say it's estimate because Canada doesn't really track rare cancers. But the difference is that there were 35,500 deaths. So what we get is an incidence of all cancers about 1 to 3.32 in terms of the number of rare and less common cancers. The problem is that the deaths on those are much, much higher. So percentage of death of all cancers is about 39%. Percentage of death for new cases of rare cancers is about 57%. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that we've actually taken from Australia. And what you can see here is that the common cancers are increasing in incidence, but they're actually, quite interestingly enough, declining in mortality relative to the population. So next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, this is the rare cancers. The difference is that the rare cancers are also increasing in incidence, and a lot of that has to do with the ability to do better diagnosis. But in fact, relative to the population increase and relative to the numbers, they're actually increasing in mortality. So again, huge inequities in terms of the research, care, and treatment, and actual, new therapies for the rare cancers. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics, and the better examples actually come from what we call the subtypes of more common cancers. So I think many people know that you've got 2 gene mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2. By actually being able to diagnose patients that actually have BRCA1 and BRCA2, you actually can screen and actually provide much more effective prevention methods for these cancers. So this has been a huge breakthrough. They're a very small percentage of the breast cancer population, but what we've been able to do is much more successfully provide treatment options that are appropriate to those cancers because of the genetic testing. The same as we're talking about a HER2 positive. Again, this accounts for about 20% of breast cancers. What is happening in terms of, as those of you will know in the cancer environment, is that in fact the preferred treatment is to actually start with targeted therapies. And because we've been able to identify this population, develop therapies that are actually matched to the genetic mutations, we have much more highly effective therapies. The other good news, of course, is that we actually are able to now, with genomic sequencing, DNA testing, whole genome and exome testing, we can actually now pick up these rare versions of more common therapies, but also are doing an increasing job of being able to identify those rare and less common therapies. And this is, in fact, a huge advantage because by being able to identify what the exact genomic mutation is, we're actually able to now match the therapies much more appropriately. One of the studies that was done, an analysis of about 423 patients, what they found was that they were able to identify genetic alterations in 2/3 of these. And 40% of them were able to have targeted genome alterations, 39% have rare alterations, and about 28% of those with targetable alterations actually were able to be matched with treatments that were already in clinical trials. So not only are you avoiding giving people the wrong treatment, you're actually able to get them to the appropriate treatments and much more effective treatments. Next slide, please. So this is, again, it's sort of an old example that I've had, but still really appropriate with lung cancer. Again, a very common cancer, and in fact, the second most common cancer, and in fact, one of the most deadly cancers. What we do know is that about 4/5 of the lung cancers are non-small cell lung cancers. The treatments of it have been surgery, chemotherapy. Survival at about 4 years is less than 70%. What we do know then is that about 4% of these have a genetic ALK mutation. And this is actually linked into kinase activity. These are generally younger patients, they're non-smokers. We have about 900 to 1,000 ALK-positive Canadians every year. And, you know, this was the first ALK-targeted therapy, and this is way back now for about 5 years, 6 years now, which actually inhibits the ALK activity because if you're able to diagnose these patients with this genetic variation, what you can do is actually provide them with the appropriate therapy. And what they found is that, in fact, 3-year progression-free survival was 63%, with an overall survival at 72%. A huge reversal in terms of what the prognosis and what the progression is for lung cancer in general. Next slide, please. So let me go back to a little bit of basics then. What is a rare cancer? What's a less common cancer? So this is an international nomenclature, and I'm only putting it out there because people always want to know the numbers. The numbers themselves actually don't mean that much, except that it does equate to research, it equates to funding, it equates to the ability to diagnose and to be able to find the appropriate treatment. So the smaller the numbers, the more challenging it is in all of those categories. Less common cancers by some international consensus are those with an incidence of between 6 and 12 per 100,000 persons a year. Rare cancers are those with an incidence of less than 6 per 100,000 years. So these are actually smaller numbers than the numbers that we use for rare diseases in general. These then refer to within the cancer community. These are specific to cancer. So as you can see, a rare cancer is indeed quite rare. The types of rare cancers, this number has not really changed. We have about 186 cancer types that are defined as rare, but we do have a category that is called ultra-rare cancers, and those that have an incidence of equal to or less than 2 per 100,000 persons per year. So that would be, in fact, very, very seldom in terms of the actual general population. Next slide, please. But as we say, the same with rare cancers and rare diseases, they're really not so rare because there are so many of these diseases. Next slide, please. And the fact is that there's a huge burden of these overall. Rare Care, which is a consortium out of Europe, identified that there were about 108 per 100,000 of all rare cancers. So each one of them may be less than 6 per 100,000, but combined there's about 108 new cases per year. And get 22% of all cancers diagnosed, new cases, are actually rare cancers. However, as we said from in our previous slides, the survival rate for rare cancers tends to be much lower than it is for more common cancers. Next slide, please. And part of that, you know, has to do with the ability to diagnose. This shows the distribution of rare tumors within all rare cancers. As you can see, there actually is quite a large number of rare cancers when you look at the overall numbers. In the hematological, for instance, 23% would be considered to be as rare cancers. In the head and neck area, 14%. So collectively, there are a large number of rare cancers. Unfortunately, the same with rare diseases, because each one of them are so few in numbers, there's a huge challenge with regard to getting an accurate diagnosis, being able to have an appropriate specialist. I think Lisa spoke to that already in terms of CML. You don't have to go far outside of a major specialty center to actually be treated, you know, as if this were a more common variety. And I think as we saw with the breast cancer example, especially, you know, because we know so much more about it, if in fact you get the wrong treatment, you're not only, you know, lessening the opportunities for actually being able to intervene appropriately, you may actually cause a great deal of harm. So this is the case in here as well, where you can see that even though the numbers are small, the percentage actually, when you combine all of the rare cancers within a category, can be actually significant. Next slide, please. So these are some of the most common rare cancers. I won't belabor it. If you want to look it up, they're actually there. What we do know in all respects is that there are rare cancers within all categories of major common cancers. Next slide, please. Leukemia, this is just one example. So leukemia is a fairly common cancer. Myelofibrosis, though, is a very rare form of leukemia. And until very recently, the median survival upon diagnosis was only 3 years. Part of the challenge is getting an accurate diagnosis. It's very easy to misdiagnose it. It's very easy to diagnose it as a much more common a variety. What we have been able to do, though, with myelofibrosis, to identify genetic defect for about 50%, a JAK2 inhibitor, and with that identification, we're able to develop a treatment that was actually specific to the JAK2 inhibitor. And what you got then as a result of being able to identify not only the myelofibrosis, but doing the genetic testing of that specific group within there, we're able to, as we said, the early results showed a 52% reduction in risk of death. Overall survival increased from 61% to 81%. And the long-term survival data actually are even more impressive. Next slide, please. All childhood cancers are by definition rare cancers. The numbers are actually quite small. What we do know is that rare and less common cancers, I'm not sure if people understand that, and just again, we borrowed this data from Australia, is that they actually account for more deaths than almost any other form of childhood interference. So more causes than the common cancers, accidental poisoning, accidental drowning, traffic accidents, the rare and less common cancers. The reason we have these slides from Europe and Australia is that we don't actually track this in Canada. I could not find any data specific to Canada. Maybe it does exist. Maybe somebody that's listening here can actually come back and tell us that we've missed some major sources of information. I would love to know, whether or not we have this information. Europe tracks it, Britain tracks it. There are specific countries in Europe that actually track it. Australia, as we said, primarily as a result of Rare Cancers Australia, actually a patient-led advocacy group, which has been able to bring in a lot of the clinicians, actually does track this. The US also does track it. Next slide, please. Again, this comes out of Australia. What we can see then is that 71% of deaths among children aged 0 to 14, or cancer deaths among children aged 0 to 14, are actually due to the rare and less common cancers. Only 5% of those are due to common cancers. And we know that there have been tremendous advances made in terms of pediatric cancers, survival, progression-free survival, what looks ostensibly like almost a cure among some of the common cancers, but in fact among the rare cancers remain extremely high. And part of it is, again, the ability to get an accurate diagnosis. Next slide, please. So this is, again, though, flipping to the other end of the scale. What we still see is that with seniors, that the rare and less common cancers also account for almost as much in terms of deaths as all the other cancers combined. And this, again, is something that's not well known, but it speaks again to the challenges in terms of diagnosis and getting the accurate treatment. They're not necessarily more lethal cancer. They're just cancers that are poorly or undiagnosed until they've advanced a great deal more, or they're misdiagnosed and then are treated inappropriately. Next slide, please. So this is, again, sorry, don't need to belabor it, shows again the same thing in terms of a 60 to 69-year-old cohort. Next slide, please. So just briefly I'm sure, many people do know this, but just to say the difference between genetics and genomics. So genetic testing is actually the study of inherited traits, the traits that are passed from one generation to another. And they talk about your risk, especially in cancer, for getting cancer. So the test for BRCA1 or BRCA2 predicts your risk for breast ovarian cancer, allows you to take some preventive action, as the very famous case what Angelina Jolie showed. And in terms of HER2 positive, again, being able to test for that allows you to have much more targeted therapies. Genomics, on the other hand, is the study of actual genes themselves and the activity of the genes that are influencing tumor growth and the spread. And with an understanding of the genomics, you're actually able to better choose a course of therapy and maybe to actually develop much more appropriate therapy. So an example is Oncotype DX testing, which really predicts how aggressive the tumor is going to be. So, and in fact, the likelihood that you might benefit from chemotherapy. So we're able then to actually be able to do a much better job of targeting the appropriate therapies, but at the research end of actually understanding how these specific genes work, are actually able to develop much more appropriate therapies. Next slide, please. And again, this speaks to the difference between a targeted therapy and standard. So we know that with standard chemotherapy, what we've got is a drug that acts mostly on any rapidly dividing normal and cancerous cells, right? That's why your hair falls off. That's why, in fact, you develop so many side effects. And they just kill cells that are rapidly dividing. And they will go for any tumor cells. Targeted therapies are quite different. They act on very specific molecular targets that are associated with cancer. They can be designed or chosen to actually interact with very specific targeted cells. So not only specific cells that are tumors, but even more specific in terms of which cells they will be. They oftentimes, instead of killing the cells, try to block the tumor cell proliferation. So they keep it from growing. So they're not trying to actually wipe them out, but they actually keep them from that abnormal growth. Next slide, please. So different types of targeted therapies. Again, I won't belabor it, but there are many therapies now, understanding the genomics, the genes that actually are associated with cancer, how they work, how they contribute to tumor growth, or how they contributed to the spread of cancer, have now been able to become much more specific. So hormone therapies that keep the body from producing certain hormones that would interfere with the hormones needed for certain tumors. So you need certain hormones for certain tumors. You can now produce hormone therapies that will keep the body from producing those certain hormones. Signal transduction inhibitors, again, cancers can spread because they are getting inappropriate signals, or they're not getting blocking signals, so they continue to grow rapidly. They continue to grow without having any kind of environmental feedback. So these are then inhibitors that interfere with that. Gene expression modulators, so there are certain proteins that have a huge role in terms of how the genes are expressed. These then therapies really target those specific proteins and how they might work, either by inhibiting them, or in some cases by blocking them, or slowing them down, or keeping them from getting to the appropriate targets. We've got apoptosis inhibitors that actually cause cancer cells to undergo controlled cell death. So you actually target these cells and actually cause them to die. Again, angiogenesis inhibitors block the growth of the blood vessels. This is actually fascinating research. So tumor cells need blood, because blood carries the oxygen and the nutrients for tumor growth. These inhibitors actually block very specifically those blood vessels to the tumor, so the tumors then actually die. Immunotherapies, which are a large portion of therapies now, can actually trigger the immune system to destroy cancer cells. So your body has natural cancer-killing T cells in it. And what the immunotherapies will do is actually then stimulate that immune system to work more appropriately, or to target very specific cells, and to be able to then destroy the cancer cells. And the monoclonal antibodies are also able then to deliver, in this case, very fascinating, a toxic molecule, for instance, a radioactive substance or poisonous substance, deliver them specifically to the cancer cell and then to kill that cancer cell. So highly targeted therapies, and again, avoiding then some of the huge side effects, of course, when you're talking about more standard chemotherapy or radiation, which are just trying to kill the cells but are not able to target specifically the cells that are causing, or the cells that are in fact the tumor cells are causing the cancer. Next slide, please. So precision medicine, I mean, this is a whole category for cancer, and it's a very exciting large field. It's not just for cancers, but obviously cancers are huge part of what is, in precision medicine, probably accounting for some 60%, 70% of the precision medicine that's being developed. And again, in a broad definition, what we're talking about is we're matching the medicines to individual genetic variations. Sort of a summary of what we just talked about. What we do know is that patients' tumors have very specific genetic changes that cause them to grow. The changes, though, can actually be highly specific to an individual, and this is, in fact, specific to specific types of cancers. And so by being able to actually profile that individual, you're able actually to match the right drugs for the genetic variants. And so, I mean, many of you will know that in some of the clinics, especially in the US, there's a huge amount of work that's being done to actually profile not only the genetics, but also some epigenetic factors, also other kinds of lifestyle and profiles with the patient to actually match them to a most appropriate course of therapy that takes into consideration the genetics, the genomics, and also the individual variations in other factors. Again, highly increasing not only the likelihood that you're able to stop or to prevent the cancer from progressing, but also matching and improving substantially the person's quality of life. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show you a little picture around a very interesting, exciting kind of a therapy that's taking place, and this is around, really getting T cells that can actually destroy the cancers. As we say, we know that we have in our bodies, T cells that are naturally targeting cancer cells. In many cases, though, your cancer cells are very clever, and they find ways that they can evade these T cells and keep them from being able to act. So this is just a little picture in many different ways in which this might happen. Next slide, please. So this has led to one of the, I think most exciting kinds of therapies to come around, and this CAR T-cell therapy. It's a form of immunotherapy. What it does, though, it actually alters the T cells to make them be much more effective, or to actually be able to bypass the evasion tactics that tumor cells have. So the process is actually deceptively simple, and in fact, we know that there are in Canada laboratories that are developing this as a process within the laboratory, as well as commercial operations that are providing this as a process. What happens is that you take a patient's T cells, you collect it from the blood, you then modify them outside of the body so that you can actually put what they call chimeric antigen receptors on their surface. So you take the T cells, you add these receptors to the surface, then these T cells are reinfused into the patient. So the patient's own T cells, so it reduces the likelihood of any rejection or other kinds of adverse effects. But because they've got these receptors on them now, these receptors are designed to attach to a specific antigen that's on the patient's tumors. So the tumors themselves have antigens. These modified CAR T cells says, okay, I'm going to go in and find that antigen. Once they plug into the antigen, they release then the T cells are then able to kill those specific cancer cells. And because, again, they're highly targeted, the likelihood of side effects are actually very, very, very minimal. Next slide, please. BiTE technology, this is something we just saw recently, which again I thought was extremely exciting. We know that, again, it starts with the basic concept that T cells target tumor cells and it keeps the tumors from growing. But as we say, these tumor cells are extremely well evolved to be able to avoid being destroyed. But BiTE technology is actually bispecific T cell engagers or antibodies that can bridge then the T cells, which are the killers, to the cancer cells, again with a specific cell surface antigen. And what they do then is, because they have this bridging component to them, they then can target these cancer cells, they release this protein destroying substance into the cancer cells, and they can kill it. The exciting thing about that technology, as it was with the CAR T cell technologies, is that they are not specific to any specific type of cancer. So you can use this technology in almost any type of cancer: breast cancer, prostate cancer, brain cancer, as long as you can get, the antibodies into them, and then you're able then to be very successful in terms of actually being able to destroy the highly specific cancer. So the opportunities for it are huge in terms of, not just for rare cancers, but for any type of cancers. Next slide, please. So the opportunities and challenges, just to kind of summarize us up here. The opportunities are huge in terms of rare cancer, and that's why we say the time is now. The biggest challenge has been actually diagnosing these rare cancers. Like all the other rare diseases, they are not well known. It is very easy when you're seeing even a specialist to actually just get a diagnosis for a much more common disease, or in this case, a more common cancer. But now with genetic testing, and especially with genomic testing, genomic sequencing, we are able to actually identify very specific variations. So as we know with some of the breast cancers, we've gone to that, not immediately, but if there is a likelihood that in fact, based on family history, or based on some of the presenting symptoms you've got, that you may actually have a genetic variation that would be amenable to a different kind of treatment. Then, in fact, with the genetic testing, you can actually identify it. With genomic sequencing, you may get to a very highly specialized variation. I have speaking to a patient very recently who was diagnosed as HER2 negative and was given a whole host of treatments. And then, her physician was not satisfied that, this was actually, was obviously the treatments weren't working for her at all. Her cancer continued to progress. She was into, stage 4 cancer at this point. Actually decided he wanted to do some genomic testing. Really, let's try to figure out exactly what's going on here. We don't actually pay routinely for genomic testing, genomic sequencing in Canada. This woman actually, they set up a GoFundMe. They collected the blood sample. They sent it off to the U.S. where it was tested, came back, and it turned out she had a very rare form of HER2, and she was actually HER2 positive. Changed the whole course of treatment for her, and actually then began to provide her with targeted HER2 positive therapies, and actually had a total turnaround in terms of her response in terms of therapies, and certainly accounted for why she was getting severe side effects to some of the other treatments that she had been given, which would not have been indicated. So genomic sequencing allows you to not only identify very rare cancers, but also being able to find rare subtypes of more common cancers. It allows you then, now with the targeted therapies, is that once we've actually identified either the rare cancer or the specific subtypes, are able to provide much more targeted therapies. And as we just talked about, now that we're getting these non-site specific therapies, the ability to diagnose and find the tumors earlier on in terms of rare cancers, we are actually able to potentially have therapies that would be useful regardless of where that therapy is. And as we talk about in terms of cell and gene therapies, what we do know is that many of these are, a lot of people hesitate to call them cures, but they're definitely durable cancers, treatments. They're treatments that likely will have, because they've been able to kill off almost all of the tumors, are likely to have very long-lasting effects. And again, we will have to wait and see in terms of how long this lasts, but certainly, some of the patients that have had these cell and gene therapies are now 8, 10, 12 years out in terms of no recurrence. The challenges, as you might imagine, are the challenges that we know, traditional clinical trials. We're not going to be able to do randomized controlled trials with many of these types of therapies. So how do you get to being able to demonstrate that these therapies are working? Can we talk about, trials with N of ones? Can we talk about other kinds of designed trials that would allow you to demonstrate safety and efficacy without necessarily having to have a placebo-controlled population that you would match against? These are the challenges, and the exciting thing is that, of course, we are evolving those kinds of trials, even as we say, individualized clinical trials. The challenge, though, even as the researchers and clinicians are evolving these novel approaches to testing these therapies, we have the concerns around regulatory approvals, which also still have to continue to balance safety versus safety and efficacy versus potential for harm, and certainly the ability to continue to track how these work. And again, we're seeing in many cases the ability for regulators to work hard. I was just in a presentation in the U.S. where they developed a specific gene therapy for one child with a very rare form of Batten's disease. And it was amazing how they got the FDA to work with them hand in hand to be able to design what is ostensibly a clinical trial for a patient of one, and actually be able to deliver the therapy and to continue to provide that therapy. As far as they know, this is the only person that has that specific genetic mutation, but she is in fact surviving with this gene therapy and continue to be monitored. Obviously, the ability to have these kinds of regulatory concordance across jurisdictions, we can't have, every jurisdiction needing to develop its own guidelines and its own procedures for approving them. Can regulators work together? Can we come up with, in this case, much more common approaches or even shared approaches, or even the ability to adopt and accept someone else's approvals? Valuation, long-term expectations, as you know, these are not going to be, quote, cheap therapies. There are going to, especially in the beginning stages, are going to be very, very expensive out front. How do we put a value on them? What can we say in terms of the long-term lifetime expectations for them? Are there schemes? And everybody's been talking about, and we need to be thinking, certainly here in Canada, what are the schemes for actually making these therapies available? Are they financing schemes? Are there investment schemes that we need to put together here? I think this is what we're all needing to consider. I'm actually down at the World Orphan Drug Congress here in Washington, and a huge amount of discussion to saying we need to be thinking about how we're going to finance these and make them available even as we're developing them. We can't wait until they're actually developed, because by that time it will be too late to think about how we get them to people. And I think that's it. That last slide there. That's it. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Durhane and Lisa, for that presentation. We really appreciate having you both here, prominent voices for rare diseases and, of course, rare cancers in Canada. A lot of really, really interesting information in there. We do have some time to take some questions. I don't have any in just yet, so just a reminder to everybody, if you'd like to ask Durhane or Lisa a question, now is the time. You can type your questions in on the little panel in the GoToWebinar panel on your right-hand side of your screen. And we'll just give everybody a second there to see if there's any questions for Durhane or Lisa at this time. I found it very interesting about... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Durhane.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to promote again the fact that we do have a Rare Disease International and Court Conference May 10th to 12th. So do check our website, and we will be having a workshop to try to create. We believe that it's very important to actually try to create a Rare Cancers Alliance here. And the same as they've had in Australia, where they've seen tremendous changes in terms of investment in research and funding, and across Europe and in the UK as well, where there are some prominent examples where rare cancers are actually coming together, looking at common issues and also looking for common solutions.
Yeah, that's great, Durhane. It's actually interesting you were just saying that, because our first question here is someone who's wondering how they can access CORD meetings. And I think this is basically the kind of things that you guys do in order to involve others in your process. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So go to the website. We have this meeting that's coming up, and we have other resources on it. If we have scholarships that are available for patients and patient groups to participate. I think the scholarship application just closed today, but I will say honestly, if you're only finding out about this now and you want to send me a personal email, I will do my very best to see how we can accommodate.
Durhane, would you be comfortable with me including your email in the follow-up email to the attendees of the webinar?
Absolutely. We're open for
Okay.
business for everybody.
Fantastic. I'll also, everyone listening in, I will include Durhane's email in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow afternoon. So if you do have any further questions specifically as to what CORD's up to and how you can get involved, that specifically you can go straight to Durhane and you'll get your questions answered. We do have some other questions coming in here, which is fantastic. So we have one here that says, how do you propose that organizations such as CORD or patients and families advocate for improved access to drug funding and support persons diagnosed with a rare long-term cancer?
Right. Lisa, why don't you start in terms of what your experience has been, because you've been a great advocate and certainly a great supporter of CORD all these years.
Thanks, Durhane. I think that there are two questions there, right? There's the supporting in long term, and how to actually make policy change, if I understand the question the right way. And so, I'll go to the supporting first. I think that if you can find somebody or a group, I know with some of the rare cancers, it's hard to find. I mean, for CML, we have people who come to our meetings who don't necessarily have CML, but they have other rare cancers, because some of the issues, the emotional issues, are the same. I think support is very key. Also, finding someone with that shared experience is really valuable in terms of education and learning how to manage not only your health better, but also for caregivers and families, friends, how to manage that diagnosis and help the patient in the best way that you can. In terms of policy, I think, Durhane, you probably want to jump in. I think this is a very one of the things that you're so passionate about. But again, collaboration with the policy and making changes, right? But I'll throw it over to you, Durhane, for that one.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And definitely, one voice alone, one rare disease alone or rare cancer alone doesn't make a difference. But we can work together, and CORD actually has been, as you know, trying to lead some of the policy work. We have a rare disease strategy, which we actually found referenced in the last budget. And certainly, I think we're really excited by some of the announcements, including, recommendations to have a separate drug plan for rare diseases, the inclusion for having in the budget, the announcement of $1 billion to start off a rare disease, a drug program for rare diseases. So I think working together, we can actually do a great deal in the rare cancers. This is what we want to explore. Is there a value? Is there an appetite? Is there a willingness to come together to say, yes, we need to be able to speak together in terms of how do we improve diagnosis? How do we make sure that, cancer systems themselves, so Cancer Care Ontario, BC Cancer Agency, Alberta, they may be doing a great job in terms of cancers, but they do not specifically develop programs to make sure that we're able to identify patients that may have rare cancers, as opposed to either missing the diagnosis or diagnosing them with more just common variations. And all of this, I think there are templates for this in the broad sense of having this international models that we can learn from. And we are very, I think, recognizing as well is that many of these precision therapies that are coming out, cancer is actually breaking away for us. They're proving these concepts. They're making it so that we are able to have some of these that are going to be available beyond the gene therapies, the cell therapies. They're not just in cancer, but cancer is among the first that's actually making that happen. But also we're learning things elsewhere. So for us, it is always the case that when you're small in numbers, the only way to actually have an impact is to work together. And I know that CML Network and other some of these support groups have been willing to embrace people that have related cancers. You don't have to have that exact cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question I'm seeing here is kind of another policy-related question. If the Ontario Health Agency takes over Cancer Care Ontario, will there be an impact on patient care and access to new therapies?
Oh my gosh. Well, the problem is we have no idea what this, Ontario, health agency is going to look like, right? And I think that's a real concern for anybody that, has in fact got cancer and recognizes the value of having an agency that is in fact that comprehensive agency around cancer. So it's a huge concern, and I know the cancer community is coming together to really try to approach the Ontario government to really provide the integrity around this program. I cannot see how they would actually not have something there. We recognize diabetes needs a program that's comprehensive. We recognize heart disease needs a program that's comprehensive. Cancer, in fact, has been a leader in terms of being able to provide that full range support. So, unless the government is totally out to lunch and, not at all, able to appreciate what the value of a program like that is, I think they would be hard pushed not to have that. But as we know, politics can sometimes be politics. So I think it's up to us to make sure that we're able to have it. We would love to see alongside and within any kind of cancer program, obviously, a focus around rare cancers, and we think that needs to be, very specific. So yes, we need to have, continue to have some Cancer Care Ontario program, and yes, within that, we'd love to see a space for the rare cancers.
Thank you so much, Durhane. I know it's a very hot topic right now across, many patient groups and patients and advocates. So not an easy question, but a good one. The next one here says, given the cost of treatment, such as CAR T-cell therapy and our government funding challenges, is there an opportunity for rare disorder parents to have access to these expensive therapies?
Yeah, it's a huge question. It's a very important question. It's not just a Canadian question, it's a global question. And as I said, I've been going down to the US at a consortium that the MIT has been putting together that really comes together to talk about how do we actually finance these. And I think the operative word is financing. We're not talking about funding. Nobody's going to be able to stand around and say, okay, we'll just give everybody, $1-2 million and fund these up front. That's not it. But I do think that, again, last December, the Expensive Drugs for Rare Diseases provincial programs proposed a managed access scheme, which basically says you start the patients. If they respond to the therapies, you keep them on therapy. If they don't respond, obviously you take them off therapy. It makes good sense. Along with that comes what we call a risk-sharing scheme. So companies can invest in helping to start the patients. If it works, you continue. Now, the difference with cell therapies and gene therapies is sometimes there are a one-time administration. So what do? The proposal in many cases is you amortize it. So it's $1 million therapy. What if I gave you $100,000 a year for 10 years? And every year that the patient continues to survive, we contribute another $100,000 back. Would that make sense? It is pay for performance. The patient continues to do well, then we continue to invest in it because that was the promise. It was a durable therapy. So I think there are ways in which we can do this that actually provide increased value for the money. Now, the challenge is you got to have a startup fund. And you've got to have that money available, in the beginning. But we can invest in that. We can get the insurance companies to help put that together. We can get the governments. And we see this $1 billion announcement that the federal government said is not for paying for therapies. I would like to see that $1 billion investment as a starter fund. Let's keep it as a rolling fund. Every year we have an additional $500,000 we can put into it. Let's use that to start patients, to get patients into promising or proven or therapies that could have a long-term effect. And then as they begin to demonstrate that they're responsive, they move into the regular drug program. We have to be able to not only do clinical trials that are different, not only have regulatory approvals that are specific to these kinds of therapies, not only have health technology assessments that look at the value of and evaluate the value of these that are different than, the old therapies. We also now have to think about how do we finance them differently. So let's get in front of it. That's why I say now, let's start to create those kinds of funds. Maybe we look at the private sector. Maybe we look at at the charitable sector to help create this kind of funds. But I think, we've got huge drug programs. I think they should be helping us to put these funds together, because, they will get paid back if it works. And if it doesn't work, then, we do not continue to pay into it.
So absolutely, Durhane. I just wanted to add too, to the beginning part of that question, how do rare disease parents, help make change? And I think it's another shout out to CORD. And the way we make change is we join together, and CORD has a ton of initiatives on the go. And as we get together, we have more power. And so if you feel the need to participate and you want to see change happen, then come out and join us, because I think the more of us that get on board, the easier this is going to be.
Thanks, Lisa. And Lisa is proof of the pudding, because she comes out there and she joins and she puts her voice in there. So this is exactly, and this is why I keep dragging her in. I always apologize. I said, I hate to keep asking you, Lisa. And
I
love you. That's great. Thank you both. We have time for one more question here, and I'm getting a bit of echo here. Apologies if anybody else can hear that. There's one question here that I'd really like to address before we finish off today. There's a few other really good questions that I'll forward to you both, and perhaps you can follow up with them after the webinar. But this last one here is a little involved, so let me get through it here. It says, Durhane spoke to the challenge that clinical trials behind precision medicines lack the robustness that traditional processes tend to need to evaluate them for funding. And we're seeing that funding for drugs and testing can come from totally separate provincial budgets, which can further complicate things. Do Durhane or Lisa have a, quote, top 3 list of changes they believe must happen in order to enable Canadian HTA to appropriately evaluate these products for funding? And what role can industry, clinicians, and patient groups play in coming up with solutions?
Yeah, that's $1 million question for $1 million. I mean, absolutely. What we recognize, and I think the regulators, those who support clinical trials and who support the approvals, have actually gotten much more in sync with it. They recognize it. They're much more working with the researchers, with the companies to design the clinical trials appropriately. We see new things in terms of pre-approvals. Give me your design. Here are the benchmarks you need to meet. If you can do that, almost guaranteed that you're going to get an approval, rather than the old way of, oh my gosh, we do it and then we dump it at you, and then we have to guess whether or not you're going to approve it. That wastes, not only time, but it wastes, people's lives. So I think being able to be open, be able to be collaborative around that. What do we need in order to make this a success? And having patients and families part of that design is huge. The problem is that HTA is not caught up with it. So most of that is still black box. Reimbursement has not caught up with it. Most of that is not only black box, it is designed on drugs for yesterday. It's designed on having all of these Me Too's that make no sense whatsoever. So yes, we have to totally blow up the approach that health technology assessment is taking today. We have to produce much more appropriate ways of assessing these therapies in terms of promising results, in terms of being able to evaluate them over a long time, and then to be able to reassess them as we have them on for a longer period of time. Germany's doing some of that. The UK's doing some of that. Netherlands is doing some of that. Even the US under ICER is doing a better job of that. So we need to adopt much more appropriate approaches to. Nobody's saying aren't going to want to know what is the right value for it, but we cannot put a dollar value on it that is going to come out of a set of clinical trials right at the beginning. Even worse is what Canada wants to do right now with the Patent Medicine Price Review Board regulations. And they want to actually put this valuation on it even before these drugs are tried out in the real world. That is absolute nonsense, and it will kill us in terms of Canada getting access to these therapies. We really are very concerned about how those proposed regulations are coming out, and what their insistence is that we are just going to look at these drugs as they're coming out, and we're going to try to evaluate what the value per quality adjusted life year is going to be, using that as a tool when we don't even have the drugs on market, when there's new technologies that don't have that kind of data. So yeah, we have to wake up. We have to get technology, we have to get assessments that are actually going to be much more aligned with what these therapies can do, what they can promise to do, and what we hopefully are able to do over a lifetime.
And I just want to jump in really quick. I know that we're at time here, but Durhane, I wanted to add to what you said about having patients and families involved. I think, I think it would be awesome if patient groups could be involved with industry, right, before the clinical trials are even designed. So we have, some accurate patient experience and lived experience, and that's what they're taking forward with them, as opposed to assumptions. That's all I want to say.
No, and that's huge, and we hear it over and over again. I'm at this World Orphan Drug Congress. Everybody starts off by saying patient engagement is critical.
Absolutely.
It's no longer just a nice to have; it is essential. And Lisa, and it's all the way through the life cycle of the drug. But as you say, even in that preclinical development phase, it is absolutely essential. But Canada, I fear, is way behind. And, the assistance on all we want to do is pay as little as we can for a drug is not going to help us in terms of nurturing and getting access to these advanced therapies for our patients. Yes, we want to pay appropriately, but we can't just go down and say, oh my gosh, can I get it as cheap as possible? I can make it cheap for you. We just don't provide it. That's really cheap.
Exactly. Well said, Durhane.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I know that's a bit of a loaded question, but a really interesting one. So thank you both so much for that great answer.